Welcome to How to Sell More. Today, we're discussing the power of storytelling in sales with John Livesay, also known as the Pitch Whisperer. Now, John is an author and a speaker and a master storyteller who helps businesses use story to close more deals. How did he get so good? Well, he has years of experience selling through story at Conde Nass, the big, huge media company that has publications like Vogue and Vanity Fair and GQ and The New Yorker and Wired and so much more. So I'm Mark Drager. Let's get into it. So John Livesay, you are known as the Pitch Whisperer, right?
Yes, I am, Mark.
Now, I did note that you've written books. You are a keynote speaker. You're hired by some of the biggest companies to come around and teach people how to really master the art of pitching. I mean, one testimonial here said within 6 months after the team listening to you, they won $5 million in new business, specifically because of the storytelling skills that you shared with that group. So I cannot wait to dig into this with you.
Great.
So let's start with the idea that all of us in sales, we focus on case studies, right? Like I know that it's my job to just convince you that we are trusted, convince you we have the best features, we have the best benefits, it's the best cost. It's like all very logical. It's all very linear. Tell me why case studies are good, but they're not great.
Well, my first premise is that people buy emotionally and then back it up with logic. That's the first aha. And so if you're just having a case study full of data and information and facts and figures, it doesn't stick. And the old way of selling with case studies is, oh, let me get people to know, like, and trust. We've heard that phrase 100 times over the decades. And I flip the script on that, Mark. And so I say, we need to start with trust. It's a gut thing. Is this email safe to open? Am I making eye contact with you? Do I have a referral to build trust? Then it goes to the heart. Do I like you? The better you describe someone's problem and show empathy, the more they think you have their solution. And then it goes to the head. Still not the time to push out information. Here's the unspoken question everybody has when they hear you pitch anything. Will this work for me? If they don't think it's going to work for them, they're not going to buy. They might trust and like you, but if it's not going to work for them, enter storytelling. That's the magic sauce to get people to see themselves in the story and want to go on the journey with you.
Now, is this a generational thing? Because I'm younger. I say younger. I feel old sometimes. I'm 40, but I remember 10, 15 years ago being at these different training sessions, these different events. And, the speakers would say like the old way of selling doesn't work. Being feature and benefit based doesn't work. We need to move to like storytelling. We need to move to insight selling. We need to move to outcome-based selling. And I've spent the last 15 years hearing that the old ways don't work. I don't know if I was experienced to the old ways or not, but are people like, is this a generational thing? Are people who came up in business maybe in the 90s or the early 2000s, are they just trained and the world has changed? Because my generation and younger, I mean, it's not a new way. This is just the way.
Well, I do think that the old way, if for people over 40, we're certainly trained to push out features and benefits and, do an analysis and, and instead of whoever made the best pitch would get the sale. I say whoever makes the best story gets the sale. When I was selling advertising for Conde Nass, Lexus was one of my clients, and they said, we looked at 50 different titles. We've narrowed it down to 10. Everybody gets to come in for 30 minutes and pitch back to back. Do not talk about numbers. We've already analyzed that. That's why you're in the final. And I went, oh, half the reps were deer in headlights. If I can't talk about numbers, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. And that's when I realized this storytelling is really what's going to make somebody see themselves as the best fit.
And so how do you go about like, okay, you're thrown for a loop. You have a certain skill set, a certain set of tools that you use when you were at Conde Nass selling. Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know, Conde Nass owns a ton of publications from, I'm not going to list them all, but
GQ, Wired, Vanity Fair,
Pitchfork, right?
Art Digest, Bon Appetit, yes.
And so you're thrown for a loop and you're like, oh shit, I can't just rely on what used to work. How do you process this in your mind? Do you have some steps? Do you have a framework? How do we move from relying on logic to now moving to emotional storytelling?
Let me give you an example from Olympus Medical. The camera company that makes medical equipment hired me to be their keynote speaker at their sales meeting. And they said, we have this equipment that makes surgeries go 30% faster. And we say that to doctors and they're not really moving the needle. It's so logical, we don't understand. So I asked a series of questions and created this case story. It sounds like this. Imagine how happy Dr. Higgins was 6 months ago using this equipment in his surgery at Long Beach Memorial, and he could go out to the patient's family an hour earlier than expected. And if you've ever waited for someone you love to come out of surgery, you know every minute feels like an hour. The doctor goes out to the patient's family, says, good news, the scope shows they don't have cancer, they're going to be fine. Then turns to the rep and says, this is why I became a doctor, for moments like this. Now this rep has this case story that he tells to another doctor at another hospital who sees themselves in the story so much, 9 times out of 10, they'll say, you know what? That's why I became a doctor. I want your equipment too. So the client said to me, oh my gosh, that gives us chills. Not only are we not telling a story like that, it never occurred to us to make a patient's family a character in that story. So 30% faster turns into that short little emotionally engaged story. So the background on how I created that everybody can use is I said, okay, 30% faster, what does that even mean? What's the normal surgery? Well, 3 hours. So 30% faster is what? 2. Okay. So we're saving an hour. Who cares about that? And then you just go through the list. Well, the doctor's on his feet, his or her feet less. The hospital might be able to squeeze in more surgeries and make more money. But what's the real emotional outcome? Not another left brain financial thing. And that's when I thought of the patient's family, having gone through that with waiting for my sister to come out of surgery with my mom and how painful that was. So once we had that hook, the structure of the case story is exposition. You'll notice I said the doctor's name, how long ago, where it was. You have to paint the picture. The second part is the problem. And as I said earlier, the stakes have to be high in the problem. You have to describe that problem in a way that they care about what's going on. And you see how I pulled you in, Mac, with saying, even if you haven't, you could probably imagine what it would be like to wait. And then the solution is the doctor coming out and saying, good news, they're going to be fine. But if the story ended there, that's not a great story. That's just a good story. What makes it great is the resolution. What is life like after? And that's the real-time dialogue. So you feel like you're eavesdropping in on the doctor, talking to the rep saying, this is why I became a doctor. And so other doctors get reminded of their purpose and their why through this simple case story. So it's 4 parts, and you structure that, and it'll totally change your outcomes when you're pitching against competitors who just push out facts like 30% faster.
This is so good, because immediately when you said 30% faster, I started to move through the mental model as well of, okay, we can clear out the OR room earlier. We can turn around more patients, 30% increased revenue. I'm thinking about the purchasing agents. I'm thinking about the CFO. I'm thinking about, like, how do we get them to make a rational decision to show an ROI on this investment? Because frankly, your story sounds like bullshit to me, right? Like, I know it's not. You said that it's working. I got little goosebumps, but as you're telling me this, I'm just going like, this is bullshit. And yet you're saying 9 out of 10 times it works. So when I earlier, you've caught me now when I was like, this is the, old school way of selling. And I've been in the new school the whole time. And yet still I go to the features, the benefits, the rational thing. And the story that you're sharing with me, I'm going like, this is bullshit. And yet, oh, there's like magic there. So I hope you understand that I'm not calling you bullshit. I'm just reacting to how foreign this very concept is to me. How do we get more comfortable telling these stories and incorporating these into our pitches?
First of all, is the awareness that you need one. And then you want to start thinking of your brain, since you're young, like a jukebox or a playlist. I say playlist for people under 40, jukebox for people over 40.
I know what a jukebox is, because they're cool and retro.
Well, yes, they're old, so old, they're back in. But instead of songs coming out, you need different stories ready to go. So if you're in real estate, for example, I spoke at Berkshire Hathaway Home Services to the team about whoever tells the best story gets the listing. You tell a different story to a young couple buying their first house versus a elderly couple downscaling versus a family growing. You need 3 separate stories depending on who you're talking to, so that particular prospect sees themselves in that story. So that's the first thing, is I need more than one story. I can't tell the same story to everybody, to customize my stories. So you figure out who your ideal avatars are, create a case story for each one of those. And then you have a little checklist. You say, is my story clear? Did it confuse them? Are there a bunch of acronyms? Is it concise? Could it be shorter? Why we want it concise is so they can remember and repeat it and become your brand ambassadors. And then finally, is it compelling? Do you feel anything? Is there emotional hook at all? That emotional connection has to be there. So when you're crafting your case stories with your colleagues and your management team, ask them, was that clear? And is it compelling as a checklist once you've got a story in place, and keep refining it like you do any exercise, and you'll get better and better at it.
We talked about the Conde Nast and the fact that you had to pitch from more of an emotional thing for Lexus. What would have been the pitch for something like that? I mean, I imagine back then you didn't have this framework. You were still figuring it out and learning it. But give me something a little bit more creative in nature, I guess, that we might be pitching.
Jaguar, that was another client I had. Jaguar's goal was, we want people to think of the car as moving sculpture, but we don't know how to do that. And we want to be part of the conversation with our target audience, and we don't know how to do that. So now that I had a clear problem described, I put my head together with our amazing marketing team. So we said we have the ability to target our subscription base and know who has a competitive model, Mercedes, BMW, with a lease expiring in 6 months. So really targeted. We're going to invite 10 couples to take a test drive. Jaguar will pick them up on Golden Globes night, go to our private Golden Globe party in the car, get the experience of it. And then after the party, they'll be taken to a restaurant with a private chef in a private dining room. And there'll be somebody from the Museum of Modern Art in the room having a conversation about art. And in between courses, people can take yet another test drive in another car. Well, we sold 3 cars that night, and they gave me $500,000 worth of advertising because I solved their problems and painted that picture and told that story of what we would do to move the needle, specifically to become part of the conversation around art.
This is so good. Like, JLR was one of my clients, and I remember sitting down. Now I'm Canadian, so we were working with Jaguar Land Rover Canada, and I remember sitting down with the CEO, and he said, it's our mission to have a Range Rover and a Jaguar in every driveway. One for him, one for her. Doesn't matter which one gets which, but we want one of these in each one of our driveways. And at no point in our work together, our conversation, was it ever what you're talking about. And again, it's just like, if the audience, sorry if you are experiencing me kind of geek out a little bit in real time, but it's because what John is sharing with us is so powerful. And it's so important. And I don't normally do this on episodes. So John, just so you know.
Oh, great. Well, I've got another story from another client if you want to hear one.
More examples, please. Give us also like the most boring. I mean, it's cool 30% with medical equipment, but just give us like the most boring thing you can think of too.
Well, Honeywell, a division of Honeywell, makes a fan.
Controllers, right? Honeywell's like controllers and all kinds of stuff.
Oh, they have so many products, but this particular product you would think was pretty boring is a fan that they would sell into the operating rooms. And you can imagine they were talking about how fast that fan went and the particles in the air. And I was falling asleep just listening to the description of the fan and what it did. And so when you have a product that's a little dry, the question you want to ask yourself and the team to craft a story is, what happens if this doesn't work? In other words, try to figure out why the stakes could be high. We need to figure out what the problem is here in order to make this have any emotional hook.
Okay, so like an oh shit moment, like when shit hits the fan, when things go wrong because you don't have the product or service that we're pitching.
Exactly. So I said to them, well, what happens if this fan doesn't work or doesn't work properly or doesn't clean as well as yours does? And they said, well, the patient could get sick because they're being opened up. And if the room's not clean, they could get an infection. I said, okay, great. That's stakes pretty high. But then I said 2 magic words I want to give everyone listening or watching today. Anything else? When you ask that question to someone, when you're getting them to describe what problem they're solving, you dig a little bit deeper. Now, if you've ever gone to a therapist, the couple comes in, they said, our love life is a problem. We fix that. We're back to normal. That's called the presenting problem. The therapist will say, that's not really what the problem is. The problem is there's hurt feelings, there's lack of trust, something else is going on besides the presenting problem. So the clients in sales give us their presenting problem. Listen, the patient could get sick. If we dig down deeper and the other reps are not, we're going to be the ones that get the better description of a bitter pain point. So I said to the people selling this fan, anything else? And they said, oh, well, now that you mention it, and this is pre-COVID, by the way, it keeps the doctors and nurses in the surgery centers are opening and cutting people all day long, and there's smoke from the lasers. And if they could get secondhand smoke damage, and I said, oh, no, that's the problem that we're going to be solving. And we're no longer talking to purchasing people. This is an HR problem. This becomes a recruiting tool that you're giving them, that we have state-of-the-art fans keeping our team safe so you can recruit doctors and nurses. The price of the fan is out the window when it's a tool that helps them recruit the best doctors to that hospital. So that's an example, again, of taking something fairly dry, figuring out a deeper problem, telling that story, and then they sold way more fans because they weren't even talking to purchasing anymore. They're talking to HR. And it became an emotional decision of, well, of course we want the best for our team, and we're going to use it as a recruiting tool. I don't care what the fan costs. We're getting that fan.
You must be familiar with the 5 levels deep approach to asking questions. So you ask, as you mentioned, the presenting problem, and maybe our audience is aware of this, but you ask the problem, and then they give you the answer, the surface, shallow answer, as you mentioned. And then you might repeat it back and say, so what you're saying is X, Y, Z. And as you mentioned, what else? And then you just keep pushing them until they almost on the 3rd or 4th time, they're flabbergasted. They're like, what are you talking about? I have given you everything. I've said it all. I'm going to be repeating myself. And you go, yeah, but what else? And they get so upset that they just blurt something out.
But the difference I'm doing now is, instead of asking the client, the hospital, or the doctors, so the purchasing people, what else, you're turning that question internally to yourselves to say, what else are we solving here that could give us an edge that other people selling fans aren't asking themselves?
And so I know in your background, you went to university for advertising. You've worked at Conde Nass. You've worked in sales. You're very clearly good at, in real time, handling what I would call the brand strategy. So understanding maybe the competitive landscape, the features, the benefits, the company perspective, and then the target audiences, the main audiences, pain points, developing the personas. You're almost doing this in real time, it sounds like. And you're spinning out basically what a creative director in an agency would come up with as the pitch. Is this something that you believe anyone can learn, or are you uniquely framed for this because of the 20 or whatever years of experience you have doing this?
Well, unlike being this incredible athlete, I know Canadians love their hockey players, or being this gifted singer and singing on Broadway or opera, storytelling is something we can all develop. It's in our DNA. We're wired for it. That's why Fitbit works so well. Or video games, you've reached the next level. We love to be involved in the story and make progress. So if you learn the structure of a storytelling, the exposition, problem, solution, and then that magic resolution of what life is like after. Because imagine if The Wizard of Oz ended when Dorothy got in the balloon to go back to Kansas, the end. Well, the story's over. But no, there's that wonderful resolution scene where she's going, oh my God, there's no place like home. And you were there. And I'm so appreciative of everyone and everything. That's why that story is a classic. And so once you understand the structure of the story and do little check boxes on that structure saying, oh, I don't have a good resolution here, or my problem's really not that compelling, nobody cares, then you start to become a better and better storyteller. And like anything else, the more you do it, the better you get.
A lot of our work that we do at our agency Sales Loop, we're working with business owners, and we're really focusing on things like customer awareness, the different levels of awareness, whether they are aware of the solution, whether they're aware of even the problem that exists, whether they're aware of you as a company. And so when I came across your framework of invisible to irresistible, I thought, this has some of the overlap with awareness, but this is a totally different framework, and one that's actually very powerful. I have been doing this for 15 years. I've read tons of books on this. I've listened to as much as I can, and I've never heard anyone speak on this. So can you share the invisible to irresistible framework and why it's so powerful?
Well, once you've got your storytelling skills mastered, then we're going to flip something else. The old way of doing selling is to do projections. I had to do them for decades. How many people are at 90%? How many people at 50? How many people at 20? Do the math. That's your projection for the quarter, the month, whatever. Have you ever in your whole career, Mark, had somebody that you were calling on say, hey, Mark, put me down for 50% on your projections? No, right? Nobody thinks of themselves as a projection or a number. So we put our empathy hat on and we say, where do they see us on this ladder from invisible to irresistible? Invisible. They've never heard of us or our product or me, and I'm invisible. Like in the dating world, not for you, you're a handsome guy, but some of us mortals would go to a party and we see somebody more attractive. But, you don't feel invisible. Like you see somebody you're attracted to and you're like, oh, I'm invisible. They don't even know I'm in the room. Let's say you're selling life insurance and you're talking to a 20-year-old. Well, that, they don't care. Then you move up to insignificant. And in the dating world, even though it was 20 years ago, what's worse, insignificant or invisible? I'm not quite sure there. But again, if what you're selling is not on my radar, I'm not going to buy a life insurance policy. I'm 20 years old. And then you move up to the interesting rung, And this is where we all get stuck. Maybe you say something funny or clever at the party and they go, oh, I'm not going out with this smart guy yet, but I'm interested to keep talking. I call this being stuck at the friend zone at work.
I've been stuck in the friend zone with clients where they're happy to take the call, happy to go for coffee, happy to go out for lunch, happy to pick my brain, happy to get a pitch. And yet when I'm like, when are we going to move forward? When are we going to budget this? They're like, oh, man, and like, ugh.
Right. And it's very frustrating for everybody. So how do we get out of the friend zone at work? We tell a story that intrigues them enough to get up next to the next level of that ladder of intriguing. Literally, I've had clients say to me after I've told a story, I'm intrigued, tell me more. How would that work? What does that look like? I can give you an example of that. And then you get up to the very top, irresistible. This is when you and your wife were first dating and you couldn't stop thinking about each other. Maybe there was texting going on back then. I can't remember that back far, 20 years ago. But, you're like, but then we have clients that love us. They're our best referrals. But like any relationship, we can take it for granted. I work with clients after I work with them on their storytelling of, okay, let's identify 2 to 3 clients on each rung of the ladder. And what are we going to do to move up one rung? How are we going to get out of the friend zone? Now we've got them intrigued. How are we going to make this offer irresistible? And when you mentioned about me getting called the pitch whisperer, that happened when Anthem Insurance was interviewing me. And it was me versus 2 other speakers. And I had said, because, we have to sell ourselves all the time. I said, oh, well, what's going to happen after, if you pick me to be the keynote speaker, what's going to happen after? Oh, we're going to have an improvisation session. We're going to have people throw out objections from the audience and role play. And I said, what if I stayed after my keynote and would whisper in people's ear something from my talk to keep the conversation going? They love that idea. I did it. People are like, can you be in my ear all the time when I'm in the field? I told that story to Inc. magazine. They're like, oh my God, you're the pitch whisperer. And that's how that story hook came. But as I was listening to Anthem decide who they were going to hire to be their keynote speaker, I thought, I have to do something that makes me irresistible compared to the other speakers. And that was what I came up with. That extra, let me give you some more value.
Now, when you were going through these steps, and for our listeners, you started with invisible. The next level up is insignificant. Then there's interesting. And you said most people get stuck on interesting. Now, the next level we're going to break into is intriguing, the whole tell me more. And then the last step, the holy land is irresistible. But I noticed when you mentioned intriguing and what I noticed also in the breakdown is you talked about this idea of leaning in. And for our listeners, even when John was speaking, he leaned forward. And, I've run a business. We've had 300 clients, 2,000 projects. We've been doing it for, over 15 years. So there's a lot of projects that never moved forward, a lot of sales meetings in that time. And I could always tell if someone leaned forward or not. And I would always say, like, I need them to lean in. And I noticed with their body language, if we went through an entire meeting, the worst was RFPs. RFP processes, no one leaned in on anything. You would say stuff and they would be cold-faced and they'd be like, that's interesting. But if people lean in just like you did, if people lean in to like physically lean in to the edge of their seat, I was like, I've got you now. Now this is a real conversation. Now I'm either asking a really pointed question or telling a great story. Now this is real. Everything before the lean in is like, not that important. And so in that step, you talked about how the power of the story, but is that it? Like, let's not overcomplicate this. Get the stories down, memorize the stories, deliver the stories, get people to lean in on them.
Well, when I was calling on Speedo, when I was at Conde Nass, I was selling ads for a fashion magazine, and I reached out to them and I said, I noticed that you have a line of sportswear coming out. Would you consider running that in my fashion magazine? And they said, no, we're running it in a fitness magazine. And I said another phrase that I love, which is, well, what if? Because when you say what if, you start painting the picture that opens up the chance for a story. We treated your sportswear like it was high fashion. And Michael Phelps is on your payroll. We could have models run a hotel swimming pool modeling the sportswear. You could invite Michael Phelps. I bet we get a lot of publicity. It'd be a great way to launch your product in a new cutting edge way. And they said, we're intrigued. Tell me more. What else would that look like? Do you think we could get Michael Phelps? And suddenly we went from a no to not just interested, but intrigued, because I started telling that story and painting a picture of what it could be.
Oh man, John, we are out of time. So many great tips here today, but I do want to ask the final question that we ask of every single guest, which is, what is your number one tip or your number one strategy to help us sell more?
The biggest tip I have for everybody is make sure that when you're telling stories, you're telling them with enthusiasm and passion. Whether you've told the story 10 times or 100, it's the listener's first time. If you're bored telling the story, they're bored listening to it. People buy your energy.
Okay, as we wrap up this episode, let's get into the 3-point roundup. Number one, decision-making is actually a pretty emotional process. People primarily buy based on emotions and then later justify their decisions with logic. Number two, storytelling is an extremely powerful tool that you can use in sales because more than anything, it allows you to take logical propositions and make them much more emotional and much more compelling. And number three, sales isn't like it used to be. Yeah, benefits are important. Problem solving is important. But storytelling and being outcome focused, now that is really how you boost sales. I want to thank John Livesay for joining us today. If you want to learn more about him, head over to johnlivesay.com. And at the same time, you could also head over to Instagram and give us a follow. Our handle is @SalesLoopBrand. One last thing. If you've made it this far into the show, you really should subscribe. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, each week, I share practical strategies and tips just like what John shared with us today to supercharge your business growth and to boost sales. So with that, I'm Mark Drager. Thanks for listening.